Good evening, dear students. Welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu news analysis. And today is 21st March, and the significance of today is World Forestry Day, right? So on this World Forestry Day, forests actually play a very important role when it comes to the mitigation of climate change, and forests are also the source of livelihood for millions of people, right? So however, forests have been facing number of threats such as deforestation, wildfires, forest fires, and biodiversity degradation or biodiversity loss, invasive alien species which are accidentally introduced by the human beings. So all these are some concerns with respect to conservation of forests, and in fact it is very important that countries must take pledge for the afforestation, and that is the best way. And community participation, community engagement is very important when it comes to the conservation and protection of the forest resources, right? So today is 21st March and today is World Forestry Day, and that is the significance of today. And so today we have a very interesting articles, and these are a very important, and there is a very high probability of these articles may be asked in your prelims and also mains examination. So in this context, we will be discussing all these important topics one by one. However, the first topic that we are going to discuss is about the World Happiness Report 2025. So recently this World Happiness Report has been released, and in fact India has made a substantial progress when it comes to the World Happiness Report. So despite India making a substantial progress in the World Happiness Report, still it is lagging behind countries like China and Pakistan. So the worst part of it is that India ranks poor than countries like China and Pakistan. So World Happiness Report is very important, but it is more important for your prelims examination rather than the mains examination. It is more important for your prelims examination, right? So therefore we'll understand what exactly is World Happiness Report, who releases World Happiness Report, what are the parameters which are taken into consideration when it comes to preparation of this World Happiness Report. So these are all very important aspects with respect to the World Happiness Report. Now, what is the context? Let's try to understand the context of World Happiness Report. So who publishes World Happiness Report? It is published by Wellbeing Research Center at the University of Oxford, right? So Wellbeing Research Center at the University of Oxford releases the World Happiness Report. And in fact, in 2025 World Happiness Report, Finland ranked as the most happiest country in the 8th consecutive year. So that means since last 8 years, Finland has been ranked as the most happiest country in the world. So we all knew that Finland is a Scandinavian country, and in Scandinavian countries the social development is much more higher compared to the other countries. So these countries, the Scandinavian countries, are socially, politically, economically well developed countries, right? So we'll understand the parameters of the World Happiness Report and the ranking of India in the World Happiness Report as well. However, here one thing that we should understand, right? So Finland is the most happiest country in the world. So the 2025 ranking that have been published by the Oxford University's Wellbeing Research Center, so it actually takes into account the data of 2 years, 2022-2024. right? So it has actually collected data, and when it has been collecting data, it has taken into consideration different factors, and accordingly the World Happiness Report has been compiled. The ranking has been given to the different countries. However, it has taken a 3-year average while measuring the happiness of different countries. Now, what are the key indicators? We need to understand the key indicators. There are some key indicators based on that the World Happiness Report has been published, right? So when we talk about the key indicators, there are 6 primary factors, and these 6 primary factors influence the World Happiness Report. So when this World Happiness Report has been made, so 6 primary factors are taken into consideration to decide how happy a country is. For example, GDP per capita. So what is the GDP per capita of a particular country, right? So how India's GDP per capita, and how is China's GDP per capita, Pakistan's GDP per capita. So this is one factor. And second factor is that healthy life expectancy. For example, in India, we might have a life expectancy of 69 years. But on the other hand, China performs better than India, and China might have a life expectancy of 74, 73 years. Right? So there are some countries where there is a higher life expectancy, and that indicates the countries are well developed, socially well developed, economically well developed, people are enjoying good standard of living, and there are a good healthcare, education facilities are being available in those respective countries where there is a higher life expectancy. And similarly, the social support. So social support is also another very important factor or another very important dimension, and that is also taken into the consideration when it comes to the calculation of World Happiness Report. And similarly, the perceived freedom to make life choices. So how people are actually making choices. For example, so this indicates that people are enjoying their civil liberties or not. People are enjoying the freedoms that are given to them by the fundamental law of the land, right? So therefore, perceived freedom to make life choices is also one of the factor. And generosity, right? So generosity is also a very important in any society. Now, generosity actually makes any society a compassionate society. A compassionate society, a society which is tolerant, society which is empathetic, a society which is empathetic. So therefore, generosity is also very, very important for the happiness and well-being of any society, happiness and well-being of any society. And similarly, corruption is also taken into consideration. The perception of corruption is also another factor which is taken into consideration when it comes to the calculation of World Happiness Report. So how many parameters? There are 6 parameters or 6 factors which are taken into the consideration when it comes to the calculation of World Happiness Report. What are those 6 factors? I'm repeating them again. GDP per capita, life expectancy of individual, the social support that has been provided by the state to the individuals, and perceived freedom to make life choices about their life, about their individual freedoms, enjoying their individual freedoms, enjoying their civil liberties, and the generosity that is existing in society, and perception of corruption. So these are 6 parameters. So remember that this is important because there is a probability that this might be asked in your prelims examination. So on this image, you can clearly see the top 10 countries, the top 10 countries in World Happiness Report. As usual, Finland is in the top spot. However, this is the ranking of 2023. So in the ranking of 2023, India's rank was 125. So India's rank in 2023 World Happiness Report is 125, and in 2024, India's rank was 126. Right? So India's rank was 126. But this year, India has performed much better. So much better in the sense that we have just understood that in the year 2024, World Happiness Report India's ranking was 126th. But this year 2025, India's ranking is 118th out of 147 countries. Out of 147 countries, India's ranking is 118th. So this is better than the previous year's ranking in the World Happiness Report. So however, if we take into consideration the score that India has actually registered for the calculation of the World Happiness Report, so India's happiness score rose from 4.054 to 4.389 on a scale of 10, right? So India's score slightly increased. So since India's score is slightly increased, so India's rank has also improved to 118th this year World Happiness Report of 2025. And however, so India's improvement in the World Happiness Report from 126 to 118, so it actually indicates India's progress. So India has been making rapid progress in number of areas, and that is reflected in India's ranking or improvement in India's ranking. However, the methodology that has been adopted to compile this particular report actually raises certain concerns, because you can see countries like Pakistan, which have been suffering with political instability and which are also facing the threat of militancy and terrorism. So those countries have a better ranking compared to India, and that's why it actually raises concerns. The methodology that was adopted in the World Happiness Report actually raises concerns because India's ranking is poor compared to Pakistan's rank. And India also believes that this World Happiness Report is not taken into consideration economic strength of a country, health of a country, governance of a country. Because see, if any country have a good health infrastructure, so it will also increase life expectancy of the people. Life expectancy of the people can be improved by the health. And if any country performs better in terms of governance, it substantially reduces the scope for corruption. And if country has a good economic strength, so its GDP per capita, so GDP per capita can also be substantially improved. But the problem with the World Happiness Report is that it has not taken into consideration the economic strength of any country, health of a country, and governance architecture of any country. And that's why the methodology that has been adopted by World Happiness Report is very often questioned, right? So it is very often questioned. Particularly India has been questioning the methodology that has been adopted by the World Happiness Report because of India's poor ranking despite the best performance in number of social indicators. And in fact, the rankings also suggest that the social factors, trust, well-being, perceptions, so they actually play a larger role in determining the happiness than the material prosperity. So what does it mean when I say material prosperity? For example, GDP per capita. GDP per capita may be considered part of the materialistic prosperity. However, when it comes to the compilation of the World Happiness Report, so more weightage has been given to the factors like the social factors, the trust as an element, and the well-being perceptions of people who are living in that particular society, right? So this is the methodology that has been adopted by the World Happiness Report for the compilation of World Happiness Report. Right, so I hope you have understood this World Happiness Report, right? So the next topic is India's looming power crisis. So now May and June are considered as summer months, with April, summer actually starts. So with the start of summer, India might experience power shortages as well. So because there will be increased demand and reduced supply of power during the summer months. Now, few things that we should understand before actually discussing this. Now, one thing is that this article has been given in the Indian Express newspaper. And this article is also very important for your General Studies paper 3. So we will be discussing about this power shortages, power crisis that India is going to face this summer in a very comprehensive and very detailed manner. Now understand one thing, that during summers temperatures increase, right? So temperatures increase. So don't you think that increased temperatures also increase consumption of electricity? So it increases the consumption of electricity, right? So don't you think that consumption of electricity will be increased if temperatures increase? Because people starts using the home appliances. They use their home appliances and that would result in increased consumption of electricity. So don't you think that increased consumption of electricity would also increase the demand of electricity? So electricity demand can also be substantially improved. So this is one dimension of electricity shortage or looming power crisis that India is going to face this summer. And the second reason, we'll try to understand the second reason as well. The second reason is that hydroelectricity. So hydroelectricity is one of the way through which we generate power. But during summer months, what generally happens? The water level drops, right? So water level in reservoirs drops. So thereby the ability of the hydroelectricity projects, the existing hydroelectricity projects to generate adequate electricity would also be dropped. So their ability to generate electricity would also be dropped. So thereby it also results in what? The power shortages. It also results in the power shortages. This is the second reason. And third reason, lack of rake availability. Rake availability with the railways. Lack of rake availability with the railways. See, in India, more than 50% of the electricity is produced from what? It is produced from the thermal power plants. More than 50% of the electricity is produced from thermal power plants. So what is the problem with the thermal power plants? So thermal power plants are run by raw material. So they are dependent on coal. So coal is required for these thermal power plants. And not all thermal power plants are located near to the source. So therefore, coal has to be transported near to these thermal power plants. And in this case, railways plays a very important role when it comes to the transportation of coal to the nearest thermal power plants. In case railways don't have adequate number of rakes to transport coal from the source to the thermal power plants, so the ability of the thermal power plants to produce adequate coal might be produce adequate electricity might be reduced. So overall this will leads to what? Overall this will contribute to the power crisis, right? So we will be discussing about this power crisis, what are the reasons for the power crisis and how we can actually overcome the power crisis. So we will be discussing this in a very comprehensive manner so that these points can use in your mains answer as well. Now understand the context. The context is that recently National Load Dispatch Center, this National Load Dispatch Center, it has recently argued that India is going to face the power crisis, or India is going to face a huge power shortage in the high demand months of May and June 2025. So in every year, summer months, there are 2 months, May and June, which are considered as high demand months, right? So both May and June are considered as a high demand months of power consumption, right? So there is a probability of in these two high power demand months, there might be power shortage, there might be power crisis, because according to the National Load Dispatch Center, so there will be a projected and estimated electricity demand shortage of between 15 to 20 gigawatt, right? So at least 15 to 20 gigawatt electricity shortage that India is going to experience in the coming 2 years. So this is what the National Load Dispatch Center has been predicting. Now we will understand the forecast that has been given by the National Load Dispatch Center. So what forecast it has been given for India's energy sector? So firstly, it has been telling us that some high risk months have been identified. So high risk months and high demand months have been identified. So both high risk months as well as high demand months have been identified. So May and June are being identified as the high demand or high risk months, because May 2025 flagged as most critical, followed by June with projected shortages during the non-solar hours. And in fact, the National Load Dispatch Center has also anticipated, and we have also discussed, that the potential energy shortage in the coming 2 months would be around 15 gigawatt to 20 gigawatt anywhere, right? In this period from May to June or July, the potential electricity shortages could be anywhere between 50 gigawatt to 20 gigawatt. And in fact, there is also a loss of load probability. So this loss of load probability actually means that, it could be ranged from 19% to 31%, indicating a reliability challenges. For example, we have been producing electricity from the thermal power plants. So the thermal power plants' ability to produce electricity might be lost, might be declined further, and that would further increase the electricity shortages in the country. So we have already discussed about the hydroelectricity projects. So the water levels in the reservoirs comes down, and declining water levels in the reservoirs also limits the ability to produce electricity through these thermal power plants. So this is also another major challenge. And in fact, the peak demand is estimated to be around 270 gigawatt. So it is estimated around 270 gigawatt in summers 2025, and that is up from 250 gigawatt. So in 2024, what was the scenario? So in 2024, the scenario was the total energy demand was 250 gigawatt, but this summer it is going to become 270 gigawatt. So that essentially means that we need more electricity, and keeping in mind the existing electricity production, so we are going to face the shortage of around 15 gigawatt to 20 gigawatt this peak summer months. And apart from that, on this image, so you can also see the states which have been producing the electricity. So the power plants which are actually facing the coal shortages. So when power plants are facing coal shortages, they may not be able to produce electricity as per their capacity, right? So therefore, this is also very important aspect, that is particularly the shortage of coal availability to these thermal power plants. And apart from that, we'll also understand the existing status of power sector in India. So what exactly is the status of power sector in India? Now, as of now, no major growth in coal based baseload capacity, and it will lead to the supply constraints during the non-solar hours. So in all these years, so the coal based base load capacity has not been augmented with respect to the thermal power plants, and thermal power plants, we have not been working proactively. When we are not working proactively on these thermal power plants to increase the base load, so don't you think that their ability to produce electricity would be further declined, and thereby it can lead to the supply constraints during the non-solar hours. So during the non-solar hours, it will lead to the supply constraints. And in fact, India's installed renewable capacity has reached 200 gigawatt. India's total renewable, so for example solar energy, wind energy, so those are known as the renewable form of energy. So they are known as renewable form of energy, and India's installed renewable capacity has reached 200 gigawatt. But we are having a very limited storage capacity of only 4.86 gigawatt. So we are having a very less storage capacity of the electricity, whatever energy that we actually produce. And apart from that, intermittency issues is also another major factor that has been impacting the availability of energy, and that may also create energy shortages in the months of May and June in the year. So what exactly is this intermittency issue? So when we talk about the intermittency issue, imagine that we have installed these solar panels. So we have installed a solar panels. We cannot produce electricity from these solar panels 24/7 all the year. So the ability to produce electricity by these solar panels might be reduced during the rainy seasons and during the winter months also, where there is a very less sunlight or very less insolation. So that is what is called as intermittency issues. So despite we are making a huge progress in the area of renewable energies, the problem here is that the intermittency issues, we may not be able to produce 24/7 electricity all out throughout the year. And apart from that, there are also delays in the construction of thermal power plants. So new thermal power plants are not constructed, or some thermal power plants are undergoing repairs due to there are number of reasons. So when we don't have adequate number of thermal power plants, we may not be able to produce the electricity that is actually required to meet the shortage. And thereby the author has been telling us that we would have a shortage of around 15 gigawatt to 20 gigawatt in the year 2025 May to June months. And in fact, the policy lapses is also another major reason because of which we might face the electricity shortage or electricity crisis in future also, because in the years 2017-2022, the National Electricity Plan actually deprioritized fresh thermal additions, creating structural deficit. New thermal power plant additions were not made as part of the National Electricity Plan of 2017-2022. So this is also another major reason why we are not able to meet the shortages. So if we have more thermal power plants, we can actually supply the coal, whether the domestically produced coal or imported coal, and thereby we can actually have the ability to meet the shortages. but the National Electricity Plan has deprioritized the fresh thermal additions, and this could further intensify the electricity shortages in India. And apart from that, so you can also go through this image, the existing installed power generation capacity in India, right? So as of 2020, the total installed capacity is 3,73,029 megawatt. And here the percentage of the coal, the percentage of the gas, for example, in the year 2020, so 55.2% of the electricity is produced from coal alone. 6.7% of the electricity is produced from gas and hydroelectricity. So around 12.3% of the electricity is produced from hydro. And so renewable energy sources, around 23% of the energy is produced from the renewable sources as well. So this is what this image has been telling us. However, what are the measures that are recommended to address the power shortages? So there are some measures that can actually be taken to address these power shortages. This can also be considered as a plausible way forward. So we have to encourage industries and also the large consumers. There are certain large consumers and also industries who actually further increase the demand for electricity, and they also consume more energy, and it would result in more energy shortages as well. So therefore there is a need to encourage industries and large consumers to shift consumption to off-peak hours. So they need to shift consumption to half-peak hours to avoid the grid stress, right? So off-peak hours means during night time, right? So nighttime households will not use excessive amounts of electricity. So therefore they need to shift their consumption to the off-peak hours, and that would avoid the grid stress. So this is the first thing that we could do during the high energy demand months. Secondly, demand response mechanisms. So those mechanisms which are in place in countries like Singapore, so such mechanisms can be put in place. So these mechanisms focus on incentive programs for consumers who reduce the demand during the peak periods. For example, there are some consumers, so incentivizing those consumers who uses a lesser amount of electricity during the peak periods. So thereby what happens, whatever electricity that we actually have, that electricity can be adjusted to the different consumers, so thereby potentially escaping these energy shortages. So the example is Singapore's demand response mechanism. And apart from that, another important step that has to be taken is installing smart meters. So smart meters are also very important, and this smart meters must be installed all across the nation, and the small meters play a very important role when it comes to the real-time monitoring and also the consumption optimization. So they optimize the consumption of electricity by the consumers, and even public awareness campaigns have to be taken up. That means educate consumers on peak hour energy conservation, like Delhi's Save Power initiative. So these are some measures that could be actually taken, and they can actually mitigate the power shortage that India could face in the coming months, right? So these are short-term measures, but long-term we have to work on number of areas, and that is very important, because with increasing GDP, so India's energy demand will also increase substantially. Therefore there is a need to explore other ways to meet the growing energy demand and escaping the shortages. And the next topic is Armed Forces Special Powers Act, and this is also a very important act which is in use. right? So recently army seeks inclusion of additional areas in Manipur under Armed Forces Special Powers Act, right? So additional areas, so we knew that Manipur is a conflict area. So Manipur is a conflict area, and therefore the government has decided to deploy forces into these conflict areas within Manipur, so that the law and order situation in the state of Manipur would come under the control, and peace and stability can also be restored in the state of Manipur. So we knew that there is an ethnic conflict between Meiteis and also the other Kuki community. So therefore law and order, restoration of law and order is an immediate priority for the law enforcement agencies in the state of Manipur. The context is that Union Home Ministry has been reviewing the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, right? So Armed Forces Special Powers Act coverage in the state of Manipur, Nagaland, Arunachal Pradesh and Assam after a recent ethnic law and order disturbances in the state of Manipur. Now, the utility of Armed Forces Special Powers Act is for both prelims examination as well as for the mains examination. For both prelims and mains, it is very, very important. So we knew that northeastern part of India has been facing number of challenges. So insurgency is a challenge, militancy problem is and it is ethnically very, very sensitive area, and illegal immigration into northeast is also another major challenge. Lack of connectivity, rugged terrain, so all these are some major challenges that this northeastern part of India has been facing, and this has resulted in a potential law and order issues in the state as well. However, in order to restore the stability in different regions within the northeastern part of India, it is important to deploy Armed Forces Special Powers Act or armed forces under this particular legislation. Now we'll understand what is Armed Forces Special Powers Act, right? So this Armed Forces Special Powers Act has been introduced in the year, or it has been passed in the year 1958, and it actually confers the members of the armed forces with certain special powers. So certain special powers are being given to the members of the armed forces. So these special powers would very often result in the human rights violations, right? So it also results in human right violations of the people. So there are number of bills filed in the Supreme Court about the Armed Forces Special Powers Act and misusing the draconian provisions of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act to violate the rights of people, right? And in fact, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act is in force in the state of Manipur right from 1980. And in fact, this Armed Forces Special Powers Act is also faces criticism with respect to because it has been excessively giving arbitrary and indiscriminate powers to the armed forces. And against this Armed Forces Special Powers Act, activists from Northeast like Irom Sharmila, so she actually launched a hunger strike since 2000 year. Now, what are the special powers which are given to the Armed Forces Special Powers Act? So there are certain special powers which are given to them. So Armed Forces Special Powers Act actually allows commissioned officer, warrant officer or non-commissioned officer or any other person equivalent rank to the above mentioned officers, so they can actually open fire, right? So they fire upon or use force against any person who is acting a contravention of any law for the time being in force in the disturbed area. So this is where the armed forces indiscriminately sometimes open fire on innocent people as well. So that is the main cause of contention here. And they can also arrest suspicious people without having any arrest warrant. So don't you think that these two provisions look draconian in nature? They look arbitrary in nature. They take away the civil liberties of the people. And these Armed Forces Special Powers Act, the armed forces can also destroy any structure suspected to house an arms dump, shelter, which armed attacks are made or likely to be made. So this is also another exceptional power that has been given to the armed forces, and they can also conduct searches without any search warrant for the evidence to recover the wrongfully confined person or property, arms or explosives, right? And these are some draconian powers which are being given to the armed forces, right? And that's why it is very often criticized, and it is also a bone of contention as well. And in fact, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act actually bars prosecution and proceedings except with centers not, right? So no action can be taken against personnel who are deployed as part of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. So it indicates that exceptional powers are being given to them. Exceptional powers are being given to the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. So on this image you can see there are number of areas where this Armed Forces Special Powers Act is fully applicable, and there are some areas it is partly applicable, and there are also some other areas this Armed Forces Special Powers Act has been lifted, right? So a disturbed area can be declared by a notification under Section 3 of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. And in fact, the central government, state government or union territory administrator can actually declare any area as a disturbed area, and accordingly this Armed Forces Special Powers Act can be enforced. And you can also go through the number of states in which the Armed Forces Special Powers Act has been introduced for the first time. However, there are some committees related to Armed Forces Special Powers Act, and these committees have also made some interesting recommendations regarding the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. So the first committee is Justice B.P. Jeevan Reddy Committee, and this committee has submitted its recommendations in the year 2004, and this committee has recommended the incorporation of Armed Forces Special Powers Act in the Unlawful Activities Act of 1967. So a merging of Armed Forces Special Powers Act with the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act of 1967. And secondly, the second Administrative Reforms Commission's fifth report in the year 2007 also recommended the altogether repeal of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, since it would remove the feeling of discrimination and alienation as well, because the Armed Forces Special Powers Act has actually given some arbitrary powers to the armed forces. So thereby the second ARC has actually recommended altogether the repeal of the ARMSFA Act. And Santosh Hegde Committee in the year 2013, it has recommended that the Armed Forces Special Powers Act must be properly reviewed every 6 months to see if its implementation is necessary, whether it is important to implement the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. So such review has to be done every 6 months. And Justice Verma Committee has also made some recommendations regarding this. So Justice Verma Committee has recommended that any sexual violence against women by members of the armed forces must be brought within the purview of ordinary criminal law. So it must be brought within the purview of ordinary criminal law, right? So